Good morning. I am Dr. Latha, Professor in Physiology, SLIMS. Today I am going to explain about the thalamus. So thalamus, in this picture you can see thalamus are ovoid structures that are present in the cerebral peduncle. There are two thalami, each on either side of the midline. So this is the cut section of the thalamus. If you see the thalamus, dorsal thalamus has two poles and four surfaces. The two poles are anterior pole and posterior pole. Four surfaces are superior surface, inferior surface, lateral surface, and medial surface. The superior pole, it lies just behind the interventricular foramen. And inferior pole, it expanded and it is called pulvinar. So this is the inferior pole and it is expanded to form the pulvinar. It lies just above and lateral to the superior colliculus. Now all four surfaces, superior surface, inferior surface, lateral and medial surfaces. The superior surface or dorsal surface. So in this picture you can see superior surface, it forms the major part of the floor of the lateral ventricle. It is convex and triangular in outline. And ventral surface or inferior surface. This is the ventral or inferior surface. This surface related to the hypothalamus anteriorly and the ventral thalamus posteriorly. Medial surface forms the greater part of the lateral wall of the third ventricle and it is lined by the ependyma. The medial surface of the two thalami are connected by interthalamic adhesion. And next, lateral surface of the thalamus is related to the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So in this picture you can see the lateral thalamus, the lateral surface of the thalamus, it is related to the internal capsule. Next we will move on to the internal structure. Like other parts of the brain, the thalamus consists of gray matter and white matter. So gray matter is very scanty and it is divided into three parts: stratum zonae, external medullary lamina, and internal medullary lamina. Stratum zonae is a thin layer of white matter that covering the superior surface of the thalamus. And external medullary lamina is a thin layer of white matter that covering the lateral surface. And internal medullary lamina, it is Y-shaped sheet of white matter. This is present on the gray matter of the thalamus. And this internal medullary lamina divides the gray matter into three parts. So in that picture you can see three parts: anterior, medial and lateral part. So gray matter, three part: anterior part, lateral part and medial part. So in the gray matter, the nucleus of the thalamus are present. So these are divided into, it is classified into two types: anatomical classification and functional classification. So anatomical classification, anatomically thalamic nuclei are classified as anterior group nuclei, lateral group nuclei and medial group nuclei. The Y-shaped internal medullary lamina divides the thalamus into three masses: anterior, lateral and medial. Three parts: anterior part, lateral part and medial part. So anatomically, the nuclei present on the thalamus are divided into anterior group nuclei, lateral group nuclei, and medial group nuclei. The anterior group nuclei, these are the mass of gray matter enclosed within the bifurcation of the internal medullary lamina, and this is called anterior nucleus. And lateral group nucleus, these are present on the lateral part of the thalamus. In this picture you can see these are the lateral group of nuclei, and this nucleus again divided into ventral group nucleus and dorsal group nucleus. The ventral group nucleus, which includes ventral anterior, here represented as VA, ventral lateral nucleus, ventral posterior nucleus. This ventral posterior nucleus again subdivided into ventral posterior lateral and ventral posterior medial nucleus, and medial and lateral geniculate bodies are present in the posterior zone of the ventral group nucleus. The dorsal group nucleus are lateral dorsal group nucleus, lateral posterior nucleus, and pulvinar. And next part is medial group nuclei. Medial group nuclei is present in the medial part of the thalamus. So the medial group nuclei includes dorsomedial nucleus and centromedial nucleus. One more nucleus is midline nucleus. Dorsomedial, centromedial, and midline nucleus. So this is given in the flowchart form. The nucleus are given in the flowchart form. Anatomical classification: anterior group nucleus. That nucleus is called anterior nucleus. That is present in the bifurcation of the internal medullary lamina. And lateral group nucleus, it is again divided into dorsal and ventral. The dorsal side, it has dorsal lateral dorsal nucleus, lateral posterior nucleus, and pulvinar. So in this picture, it is represented in the gray color. And ventral part of the lateral group nucleus, there are three nucleus: ventral anterior, ventral lateral, and ventral posterior. This ventral posterior again divided into ventral posterior lateral and ventral posterior medial. Apart these two more nucleus: medial geniculate nucleus and lateral geniculate nucleus. And medial group nucleus, there are three nucleus: dorsomedial nucleus, centromedial, and midline nucleus. So this also giving the different nucleus of the thalamus. So this white color is Y-shaped internal medullary lamina, and between the bifurcation anterior nuclei, and this is the lateral nucleus, and this one is the medial nucleus. Next one is the functional classification. Functionally, the thalamus is classified into thalamus nucleus are classified into non-specific projection nucleus and specific projection nucleus. Non-specific projection nucleus, the nucleus comes under this category are midline nuclei and centromedian nuclei. So these are present on these are the medial group nucleus. Non-specific projection nucleus are midline nucleus and centromedian nucleus. Specific projection nucleus are specific sensory relay nuclei. It is further divided into specific sensory relay nuclei and motor control nuclei. Specific and two more: visceral efferent control nuclei and integrative and perceptual function control nuclei. The specific projection nuclei is again divided into four: specific sensory relay nuclei, motor control nuclei, visceral efferent control nuclei, integrative and perceptual function control nuclei. The nucleus comes under the specific sensory relay nuclei or medial geniculate nucleus, lateral geniculate nucleus, and posterior ventral group of nucleus. The nucleus comes under the motor control nuclei are ventral anterior and ventral lateral nucleus. Visceral efferent control nuclei are anterior group nuclei and dorsomedial nucleus. Integrative and perceptual function control nuclei are pulvina, lateral posterior nucleus, dorsal lateral nucleus. Next, we will move on to the connections of thalamus. Afferent and efferent connections of the various thalamic nuclei based on their functional classification are connection to non-specific projection nucleus and connections to specific projection nucleus. First, we will discuss about the connection to non-specific projection nucleus. These are functionally associated with different thalamic projection which produce marked changes in the electrical activity of the cerebral cortex when they are stimulated. The non-specific projection nucleus which include centromedian nucleus and other intralaminar nucleus, midline nuclei. The afferent to this nuclei come from the RAS, reticular activating system, basal ganglia, and other thalamic nuclei. The efferent from these nuclei projected to stratum and the entire neocortex. Next one, connection to the specific projection nucleus. The connection, these nuclei receive specific sensation and project to specific portion of the neocortex and limbic system. Depending upon the type of sensation, the specific projection nuclei can be divided into 4 groups. Specific sensory relay nuclei, motor control nuclei, visceral efferent control nuclei, and integrative perceptual function control nuclei. Specific sensory relay nuclei, first nucleus is medial geniculate body. The afferent of the medial geniculate body, it receives a topically organized projection of auditory fibers from the cochlear nerve. It receives afferent fibers from the cochlear nerve, lateral lemniscus, and inferior colliculi. The efferent fiber goes to auditory cortex, area number 41 and 42. Next one, lateral geniculate body. The lateral geniculate body, it receives the afferent from optic tract and superior colliculi. The lateral geniculate body is shown an orderly organized representation of the retina. They receive projection from the optic tract from both eyes. They also receive projection from the superior colliculi. In the lateral geniculate body, the macula is represented in the caudal 2/3, whereas remaining retina is represented in the rostral 1/3. The efferent fibers from the lateral geniculate body goes to the visual cortex, area number 17, 18, and 19. So next one, ventral posterior nucleus. It receives the afferent fibers. Okay, so it has a 2 division, ventral posterior nucleus. Okay, ventral posterior lateral and ventral posterior medial. The ventral posterior lateral nucleus, it receives the afferent fibers from the medial lemniscus and spinothalamic tract. The medial lemniscus carrying the afferent fibers from the nucleus gracilis, cuneatus, and the spinothalamic tract it terminates in the VPL. VPL receives the somatosensory impulses from the trunk and limb. Next one is the ventral-posterior medial nucleus. It receives the afferent fiber from trigeminal lemniscus and taste fibers. The trigeminal lemniscus carrying the afferent from the face and taste fibers. It brings the taste sensation. Apart from this, the VPM also receives the somatosensory impulses from the face along with the sensation of taste. Okay. And next one is the efferent fibers. Efferent fibers from the ventral posterior nucleus goes to the post central gyrus, area number 312. So next one is the motor control nuclei. First one is ventral lateral nucleus and second one is the ventral anterior nucleus. The ventral lateral nucleus is the chief motor nucleus of the thalamus. It acts as a relay station for cerebellar impulses. It receives the dentothalamic fibers from the from the dentate nucleus of the opposite cerebellar hemisphere. It also receives fibers from globus pallidus via the thalamic fasciculus. The efferent fibers, it goes to the projected into the primary motor cortex and premotor cortex, area number 4 and 6. It relays proprioceptive movement and voluntary motor functions. Next one is the ventral anterior nucleus. Ventral anterior nucleus is involved in the programming of the movements and it is controlled by the basal ganglia. So it receives afferent from the globus pallidus, cerebellum and substantia nigra. The efferent fibers goes from the ventral anterior nucleus goes to the premotor cortex, the area number 6. This ventral anterior nucleus mainly involved in the programming of the movement. This mainly involved in the programming of the movement. Next one is the visceral efferent control nuclei. These nuclei concerned with visceral efferent control mechanism. So these the nucleus comes under the visceral efferent control nucleus are anterior nucleus and dorsomedial nucleus. The anterior nucleus belongs to the Pappas circuit. Anterior nucleus, it belongs to the Pappas circuit of the limbic system and it is concerned with recent memory and emotions. It receives afferent from the hippocampus directly via the fornix and relayed through mammillary body. The efferent from the anterior nucleus goes to the cingulate gyrus, area number 24 of the cerebral cortex. It mainly concerned with the recent memory and emotions. And next one is the dorsomedial nucleus. Dorsomedial nucleus has reciprocal connection with prefrontal cortex and hypothalamus. Its point-to-point interconnections with the prefrontal cortex implying the important functions in thinking, memory, judgment, and emotional behavior. So next one is the integrative perceptual function control nuclei. The nucleus comes under these are pulvinar, lateral posterior nucleus, dorsal lateral nucleus. The pulvinar nucleus, it is mainly concerned with the integration of visual, auditory and other sensation. So it receives the afferent impulses from the superior and inferior folliculi and send the efferent fibers to parietal, occipital and superior temporal cortex. The lateral posterior nucleus, the lateral posterior nucleus, it receives the fibers from the superior folliculi and project the efferent fibers to the superior parietal lobe, cingulate and parahippocampal area. Next one is the dorsal lateral nucleus. The afferent fibers to the dorsal lateral nucleus, it mainly from the superior folliculi and the efferent fibers goes to the cingulate gyrus and part of the hippocampal formation. So in this picture, you can see the different connections of the thalamic nuclei. So anterior nucleus, mammillothalamic tract, and ventral anterior and ventral lateral receives from globus pallidus. Okay, so this picture showing the connections of the afferent and efferent connections of the thalamic nuclei. So next one is the functions of thalamus. The thalamus is very important because it has many functions. It is one of the important part of the brain. It has the many functions. It is the sensory relay center. It acts as a sensory relay center. Almost all the sensory impulses reach the thalamic nuclei, which relay them to the cerebral cortex by a series of projection fibers collectively termed the thalamic radiations. Except olfaction, all the sensory fibers that relay in the thalamus. So next one is the center for integration of sensory impulses. The thalamus is not only great relay station for all sensation, but also forms a major center for integration and modification of peripheral sensory impulses before the impulses are projected to the specific areas of the cerebral cortex. These functions of the thalamus is called processing of sensory information. Because of this, thalamus is usually considered as a functional gateway of the cerebral cortex. So next function is center for perception of sensation. It's act as a crude center for perception of sensation. So in addition to processing and relaying of sensation, thalamus also act as a crude center for sense perception. Pain sensation is perceived in the thalamus itself. Usually the sensation have two qualities. One is the discriminative nature and another one is the affective nature. The discriminative nature is ability to recognize type, location and other details of the sensation. It is the function of cerebral cortex. The affective nature is the capacity to determine whether a sensation is pleasant or not, or agreeable or disagreeable. It is the function of the thalamus. So it has an affective nature of the perception. Okay. So next one is the center for integration of motor function. Center for integration of motor function. The thalamus receives the output from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum before projecting it to the motor cortex, thereby helping in integration of motor functions by unconscious regulation of muscle tone. So next function is, it plays important role in the arousal and alertness reaction. The majority of the non-specific ascending impulses from the reticular activating systems are relayed to thalamus before proceeding to cortex. Though these fibers of the thalamus is involved in controlling the level of consciousness and maintaining state of alertness and wakefulness. Next one is the role of role in emotion aspect of the behavior. It plays important role in emotional aspect of the behavior because it has an intimate connection between the frontal cortex and hypothalamus. The thalamus involved in subjective feeling of various emotions. Thus, it acts as a part of limbic system. It also forms the part of Pappas circuit and it is concerned with recent memory and emotion. Next one is, it plays important role in language. The integration between the different cortical parts by subcortical connections in the thalamus helps to play important role in language. It helps to achieve the speech. Next one, role in synchronization of electroencephalogram. Thalamus also plays important role in the genesis of synchronization of electroencephalogram. So next one is the Center for Integration of Visceral and Somatic Functions. The thalamus receives somatic as well as autonomic sensation and it is connected with hypothalamus. Because of this, it is also act as a center for integration and visceral and somatic functions. So next one is the perception of sexual sensation. So thalamus, it acts as a center for perception of sexual sensation. And finally, center for reflex activity. All the sensory fibers, as all the sensory fibers relay in the thalamus, it forms the center for many reflex activity. Next one is the applied aspect, thalamic syndrome. Thalamic syndrome is a disturbance of emotional response to sensory experience. The cause for the thalamic syndrome are damage to the posterior ventral and posterior lateral nucleus due to thrombotic blockage of Thalamo-Geniculate branch of posterior cerebral artery. The sign and symptoms of thalamic syndrome occurs in opposite side of the body. So first sign and symptom is sensory symptoms. A stereognosis. The sensory symptoms due to involvement of the posterior ventral nucleus. So first one is the A stereognosis. It occurs due to loss of tactile localization, tactile discrimination, and stereognosis. So stereognosis is nothing but ability to identify the familiar object with the closed eyes. So in the thalamic syndrome, the person cannot identify the familiar object by touching, and loss of tactile localization and discrimination. So next one is thalamic phantom limb. Thalamic phantom limb, in this case, the patient is unable to locate the position of the limb with the closed eyes. and search for the limb in the air. So when the person closed his eyes, he is unable to locate his limb, and he will search his limb in the air. This occurs due to loss of kinesthetic sensation. And next one is the thalamic overreaction. So that is the threshold for the pain, touch and temperature is decreased, and the sensation becomes exaggerated and disagreeable. The threshold decreases so that the sensation becomes exaggerated and disagreeable. Next one is the amygdalosis. So it is the illusion felt by the patient that his limb is absent. So next one is the motor symptoms. The motor symptoms are occurs due to the involvement of the posterolateral nucleus. So first one is the ataxia, decreased muscle tone and profound muscular weakness occurs due to damage to the cerebellar afferents. And next one is the involuntary movements. These involuntary movements are due to involvement of the fibers coming from the globus pallidus, leads to chorea or athetosis. And intention tremor. Next one is the intention tremor. The intention tremor usually associated with thalamic syndrome. Intention tremor means while doing any work, the patient is having tremor. So that is it is usually associated with thalamic syndrome. And the next one is the thalamic hand or athetoid hand. So thalamic hand or athetoid hand, it refers to abnormal posture of hand occurring in patient with thalamic syndrome. It is characterized by moderate flexion of the wrist and hyperextended fingers. So next one is the Korsakoff syndrome. The Korsakoff syndrome refers to lesion of medial-dorsal nucleus of thalamus characterized by difficulty in remembering new information. And next one is the, so one more thing, frontal lobectomy for relief of intractable pain. For relief of intractable pain, connection of the dorsal nucleus of the thalamus with the frontal lobe are divided surgically, especially by an operation called frontal lobectomy, after which the patient feels the pain but does not show a disagreeable response. So once again, I will repeat the same thing. So thalamus, it is a ovoid body. There are two thalami present either side on the midline. So it has two poles and four surfaces, anterior pole and posterior pole. Four surfaces are superior and inferior. Four surfaces are superior, inferior, medial and lateral. The two poles are anterior pole, that is just behind the interventricular foramen, and posterior pole is expanded to form the pulvinar, and it is lies just above the lateral and superior colliculus, and four surfaces. Superior surface also known as dorsal surface, inferior surface also known as ventral surface. In this picture you can see lateral and medial surface. So the superior surface, it forms the major part of the floor of the third lateral ventricle, and inferior surface, the anteriorly it is related with subthalamus and hypothalamus, posteriorly with ventral thalamus, and lateral surface it forms the major lateral wall of the third ventricle, medial surface, and the lateral surface it is related to the internal capsule. and it has the white matter and gray matter. The white matter is candy, and which includes stratum zonae, external medullary lamina and internal medullary lamina. Stratum zonae is a thin layer of white matter covering the superior surface of the thalamus. External medullary lamina, it is a thin layer of white matter covering the lateral surface of the thalamus, and internal medullary lamina, it is Y-shaped. In this picture you can see it is Y-shaped. It is present on the gray matter. Okay, so next one is the gray matter. The gray matter, major part is gray matter, and it is divided by the Y-shaped white matter into three mosses: anterior part, lateral part, and medial part. So next one is the classification of thalamic nuclei. It is classified anatomically and functionally. So anatomical classification of anterior nucleus, lateral nucleus, and medial nucleus. So anterior nucleus, it is present between the bifurcation of Y-shaped internal medullary lamina, and lateral nucleus, these are present laterally, and there are different, it is divided into dorsal and ventral part. Dorsal part, which includes lateral dorsal, lateral posterior, and pulvinar nucleus. And ventral part, it has ventral anterior, ventral lateral, and ventral posterior, medial geniculate and lateral geniculate. That ventral posterior again divided into ventral posterior lateral and ventral posterior medial nucleus. And medial group, it has dorsomedial, centromedial, and midline nucleus. Functional classification. Functionally, it is divided into non-specific projection nucleus and specific projection nucleus. The non-specific projection nucleus are midline nuclei and centromedial nucleus, and specific projection nucleus are specific sensory relay nuclei, motor control nuclei, visceral efferent control nuclei, and integrative and perceptual functional control nuclei. Specific projection relay nuclei, the specific sensory relay nuclei are medial geniculate, lateral geniculate, and posterior ventral group of nucleus. Motor control nuclei are ventral anterior, ventral lateral, and visceral efferent nuclei are anterior group nuclei, dorsal group nuclei. And integrative and perceptual function control nuclei are pulvinar, lateral posterior, and lateral, dorsolateral nucleus. So connections also I already explained. So connection to the non-specific projection nucleus, it receives the afferent fiber mainly from RES, basal ganglia, and other thalamic nuclei. It projects its efferent fibers to entire cortex, and connections to the specific projection nucleus. Actually, this specific non-projection nucleus, it receives diffusely from the reticular activating system, basal ganglia, and other thalamic nuclei. Okay, and it has a specific projection. That's why it is called specific projection nucleus. So specific sensory relay nucleus, motor control nucleus, visceral efferent control nucleus, and integrative perceptual control nucleus. And next one is the this one showing the connections of afferent and efferent fibers of the thalamus. So next, the functions of the thalamus. It acts as it is a major sensory relay center, and it is a center for integration of sensory impulses, center for perception of sensations, center for integration of motor function, play important role in arousal and alertness reaction, play role in emotional aspect of behavior, play role in language. It plays a role in synchronization of electroencephalogram. It acts as a major center for integration of visceral and somatic functions, perception of sexual sensation, and center for reflex activity. So applied aspect, thalamic syndrome, and another one is the Korsakoff syndrome, then frontal lobectomy. Thank you. கடவுளே. இவ்வளவு நேரம் கஷ்டப்பட்டு பண்ண ஏன் மோதி இந்த 1:30 வரண்டா வேலை வேணாம் சார். அமைதியா இருந்து நீ தொல்லை பண்ணாத, நானே இந்த கஷ்டத்துல இருக்கேன்.